worthless, a financial burden. The words from Tyler's divorce filing seemed to pulse on the page, each syllable like a tiny dagger. I placed the document on my antique mahogany desk, a family heirloom Tyler had always dismissed as outdated, junk, and gazed out the window of my Boston office at the falling autumn leaves. How ironic that after 6 years of marriage, my Harvard-educated real estate developer husband had reduced me to nothing more than a line item on a balance sheet. A negative one, apparently. My name is Emily Wilson, and at 32 years old, I never expected to be labeled financially dependent with no marketable skills in legal documents that would permanently mark the end of my marriage. Especially not while I was finalizing paperwork for a $100 million inheritance that would transform Boston's abandoned Riverside Mill into the city's most innovative mixed-use development. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I glanced through the window of my office at the converted carriage house behind my late grandfather's Beacon Hill home. Olivia, Tyler's assistant, was walking across the courtyard, her designer heels clicking authoritatively on the cobblestones. She'd been visiting more frequently lately, bringing documents for Tyler's signature, asking pointed questions about the Wilson family properties, and showing unusual interest in my grandfather's estate proceedings. Today, her Hermes scarf, identical to one I'd seen in my grandmother's collection just last week, fluttered in the autumn breeze. The notification sound from my laptop pulled my attention back to reality. Another email from Michael Chen, my attorney, confirming our meeting with the probate judge. Grandfather Wilson's estate was nearly settled, with final distribution set for next week. I'd kept the inheritance proceedings private, not out of secrecy, but from a lesson Grandfather had instilled in me since childhood. True wealth whispers, Emily. It never shouts. Tyler, with his luxury condo developments and flashy reputation in Boston real estate circles, had always mocked my family's preservation work. Playing with old buildings, he called it, even as our restoration projects revitalized neighborhoods and won national awards. He never understood the vision behind preserving historical properties while making them viable for modern use. Never appreciated that the Wilson name had quietly become synonymous with the most prestigious historical renovations across New England. Your little hobby, he'd say dismissively, even as I expanded our restoration business beyond Boston to Providence and Portland. Even as architectural journals featured our work. Even as I secured the bid to transform the abandoned Riverside Mill, the largest historical preservation project in Massachusetts history. Emily? Olivia's voice interrupted my thoughts as she appeared in my doorway. Tyler asked me to remind you that the movers are coming Saturday for his things. Her eyes darted around my office, lingering on the architectural plans spread across my desk. I casually slid my grandfather's estate documents underneath them. Thank you, Olivia, I replied, keeping my voice neutral while noting the smug satisfaction in her expression. The vintage sapphire bracelet on her wrist caught the afternoon light, identical to the one my grandmother had gifted me for our 5th anniversary. Tyler had claimed it was lost during our move to the Seaport condo last year. Will you be needing anything else? She asked, her eyes continuing to scan the room. No, that's all. I'll be in meetings the rest of the day. I turned back to my computer, opening my secure folder containing the Riverside Mill development plans. Tomorrow, I would change all my passwords and revoke Olivia's access to the Wilson preservation files. Standard protocol for someone who I strongly suspected would be submitting her resignation soon. After she left, I reached for my phone to text Grace Washington, my godmother and mentor who had taken over as Wilson Preservation's operations director after my grandfather's passing. Meeting with Michael tomorrow at 2. Final papers ready for both situations. Grace had been my grandfather's closest friend and business partner for 40 years. She was the only person besides Michael who knew the full extent of what was happening, both with Tyler and with the inheritance. "Perfect timing," she responded immediately. "Just found out Tyler's seeking investors for that Charlestown waterfront project, spending money he doesn't have yet." I wasn't surprised. Tyler had always been about appearances, leveraging himself to the maximum for the next big deal, constantly chasing what he called real money. The kind of flashy developments that got your picture in Boston Magazine and your name on donor walls. The final divorce papers needed my signature. Tyler wanted a clean, quick break, citing irreconcilable differences and my supposed financial dependence. What he didn't know was that while he was planning his exit, I was finalizing my grandfather's vision for the Wilson legacy and implementing the strict terms of his will that had been decades in the making. I reached for my fountain pen, another family heirloom Tyler had called pretentious, and signed my name with a steady hand. A strange calm washed over me. Grandfather Wilson had always said, "The best response to disrespect isn't anger, Emily. It's patience. Let time reveal what words cannot." 3 days later, I sat in Michael Chen's office in a centuries-old building on State Street, finalizing both the divorce settlement and the inheritance paperwork. Outside the tall windows, Boston Harbor glistened in the distance, the same waters. My ancestors had sailed to build the Wilson shipping business 5 generations ago, before my grandfather transformed it into historic preservation. "Ms. Wilson, you understand that by not contesting the divorce or disclosing the pending inheritance, Mr. Reed will forfeit any claim to your family assets," Michael said, sliding his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "The timing is fortuitous." I nodded, remembering the night 6 months ago when I'd first suspected something wasn't right. Tyler had been networking more frequently at exclusive industry events. Olivia had started appearing at our home unannounced with urgent paperwork. And my grandfather, in the final stages of his illness, had pulled me aside during my last visit to the Cape Cod estate. "Emily," he'd whispered, his once powerful voice faded, but his eyes still sharp. "The plans are in the library safe. The combination is your grandmother's birthday. Read them alone." The next morning, I discovered his meticulous documentation of every Wilson property, business holding, and investment, along with his suspicions about Tyler's intentions for them. "I understand perfectly," I replied to Michael, signing another document with precision. "Tyler made his choice believing I paused, quoting Tyler's words with a slight smile. "Financially dependent with no marketable skills. I see no reason to correct his assumption." The probate court had been explicit. Absolute confidentiality until the will was executed. Not even our company's senior managers knew the full extent of my grandfather's holdings or his plan to consolidate them under my direction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Only Grace, who had helped him structure the transition, understood the vision. "The court will officially transfer the assets on Friday," Michael continued. "The Riverside Mill project will be announced Monday at the mayor's economic development breakfast. Your grandfather's timing, as always, was impeccable." My phone vibrated with a text from Grace. "Olivia just submitted her resignation, effective immediately. Says she's pursuing a transformative opportunity in luxury real estate." "Right on schedule," I murmured. "Should we be concerned?" Michael asked, looking up from the documents. I shook my head. "No, just the expected departure of someone who believes they've secured a better position." I didn't mention that I'd already transferred all her access to a monitored account that would track any attempts to reach sensitive information. In preservation work involving properties worth millions, you learn to secure your blueprints before announcing renovations. Later that afternoon at our downtown crossing office, I overheard 2 of our junior architects discussing how Olivia had been boasting about her exclusive investment opportunity in the Charlestown waterfront development. Something about insider access to Boston's most privileged real estate family, and guaranteed returns. I recognized the glint of ambition that had probably attracted Tyler, both so convinced they could access old Boston money through shortcuts rather than substance. I turned back to my computer, reviewing the final details for Monday's announcement. Let them chase their waterfront dreams while I built something with true lasting value. The inheritance became official on Friday morning. As I stood in the probate judge's chambers watching him sign the final documents transferring $100 million in property assets, business holdings, and the substantial Wilson Foundation endowment into my control, I felt the weight of my grandfather's legacy. This wasn't just money. It was 5 generations of careful stewardship, of respecting history while building for the future. Your grandfather was very specific about the timing, Judge Harrington said, affixing the court seal to the documents. The 10-year waiting period from his death was unusual, but he was adamant that his heir should have time to establish themselves independently before assuming control of the full estate. I nodded, thinking of how grandfather had insisted. I work in every department of Wilson preservation, from architectural assessments to community engagement, before taking any leadership role. He believed inheritance without understanding was dangerous, I replied. Well, he'd be proud of what you've built on your own merits, the judge said, handing me the final papers. The Wilson Riverside development is the talk of Boston's planning department. I was about to respond when my phone buzzed with a message from Michael. Divorce finalized this morning. Reed didn't contest any terms. Congratulations. You're officially single and significantly wealthier. On Monday morning, I arrived early at the Boston Harbor Hotel for the mayor's economic development breakfast. The Wilson Riverside Mill project would be the centerpiece announcement, the transformation of a derelict industrial complex into affordable housing, creative workspaces, community gardens, and a museum celebrating Boston's industrial heritage. Unlike Tyler's luxury developments that priced out original residents, this would revitalize a neighborhood while preserving its character and accessibility. As I checked my presentation notes, Nathan Harper, our financial advisor, approached with a concerned expression. Emily, have you seen the news? He asked, showing me his tablet. The headline from the Boston Business Journal read, Reed Development Announces Exclusive Charlestown Waterfront Project, Investors Enthusiastic. Below was a photo of Tyler and Olivia at what appeared to be a lavish launch party, champagne, flutes raised as they stood before a rendering of a gleaming tower of glass and steel. Apparently, they're claiming to have insider connections to historical properties around the harbor, Nathan continued. They've raised substantial capital. Already, I scanned the article, noting Tyler's quote. After years of being constrained by outdated preservation ideas, I'm excited to bring truly modern luxury to Boston's waterfront. This exclusive opportunity is only available to our select investor, Circle. I see, I said calmly, returning the tablet. And the Wilson properties mentioned? That's just it. They're implying access to historical buildings that are part of your inheritance, properties they couldn't possibly have rights to develop. I took a deep breath, remembering grandfather's words. In business, Emily, never react immediately to provocation. Observe, consider, then act decisively. Let's proceed with our announcement as planned, I said. The court documents were filed Friday. By this afternoon, the public record will show exactly who controls the Wilson properties. The mayor's introduction came right on schedule, highlighting Boston's commitment to thoughtful urban development that honored the city's past while building its future. As I took the stage to unveil the Riverside Mill project, I noticed several real estate reporters checking their phones with increasing interest, their expressions shifting from professional attention to surprised engagement. My presentation was met with enthusiastic applause. especially the affordable housing component and the green technology innovations that would make the historic buildings energy efficient while preserving their architectural integrity. As I concluded, the mayor returned to the microphone. I'm thrilled to announce that the city has approved expedited permits for this project, given its exceptional community benefits. The Wilson Riverside development represents the best of Boston, honoring our history while creating an inclusive future. The questions afterward were pointed but expected. Ms. Wilson, how does this project relate to your grandfather's estate, which court records show was just transferred to you on Friday? The Riverside Mill is the cornerstone of my grandfather's vision for responsible development, I explained. This project has been in planning for 10 years, with the timing of the announcement tied to the completion of the probate process. What about the Reed development announcement of waterfront properties? Aren't some of those buildings part of the Wilson portfolio? I maintained my composure. I can't speak to Mr. Reed's announcements. However, I can confirm that as of Friday, all Wilson properties are under the sole direction of Wilson Preservation and its board. Any development plans would require our approval. As the event concluded, my phone lit up with notifications. The Boston Globe had already published an online article. Wilson Heir unveils $100 million historic preservation project. Minutes after ex-husband announces development of properties he doesn't control. I silenced my phone and focused on the conversations around me. City officials eager to support the project. Community advocates enthusiastic about the affordable housing. Historians excited about the industrial museum component. This was the real work, not the drama. That evening, as I sat in my grandfather's library at the Beacon Hill house, now officially my house, Grace arrived with a bottle of my grandfather's favorite whiskey and 2 crystal glasses. He would have enjoyed today immensely, she said, pouring us each a finger of the amber liquid, especially the timing. I smiled, looking around at the books and maps that had inspired my love of history and architecture. Not my doing. The court process just happened to conclude last week. Of course, Grace said with a knowing smile. She'd worked with my grandfather long enough to know he left nothing to chance. Tyler's lawyers have been calling Michael all afternoon. Apparently, their investors are asking uncomfortable questions about property ownership. I imagine they are, I replied, taking a sip of whiskey. Tyler always did skip the due diligence when a deal looked flashy enough. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. This is a misunderstanding. I had no idea about your grandfather's estate. Tyler. I showed Grace the message without commenting. 10 years, she mused. Your grandfather required you to work 10 years building your own reputation before you could inherit. Tyler couldn't wait 10 days after filing for divorce before trying to capitalize on properties he thought you'd eventually control. Different priorities, I said simply. Different values. The next morning brought a flurry of developments. The Boston Business Journal published a follow-up article. Reed development investors demand answers about Charlestown project viability. Apparently, Tyler had leveraged everything on the promise of developing historical properties that were now publicly confirmed as part of my inheritance. As I prepared for a meeting with the Riverside Mill architects, Michael called. Tyler's requesting an urgent meeting, he said without preamble. Claims there's been a serious misunderstanding about the divorce filing. Says he didn't read the details before his lawyer submitted them. I see, I replied, looking out over Boston Common from my office window. And what does he want from this meeting? He didn't say specifically, but given the timing, I can guess. His Charlestown project is imploding? Several investors have already filed complaints with the Attorney General's office about potentially fraudulent claims regarding property access. I considered this information, thinking about the years Tyler had dismissed my preservation work, while boasting about his real developments. How he'd mocked my family's careful, community-minded approach as old-fashioned and unprofitable. Tell him I'm unavailable, I finally said. I have $100 million project to launch and a family legacy to honor. His misunderstandings are no longer my concern. After hanging up, I turned my attention back to the Riverside Mill plans. The project would transform not just an abandoned building, but an entire neighborhood, creating affordable homes and jobs, while preserving a piece of Boston's industrial heritage. This was what the Wilson name had always stood for: responsible stewardship, not exploitation. My phone buzzed again with another text from Tyler. "Emily, please. Investors are backing out. I didn't know about the inheritance. We can work something out." I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the message to Michael with a brief note. "Please inform Mr. Reed that all communication should go through proper legal channels. Also, let the Attorney General's office know that I'm available if they need any clarification about the Wilson properties." Grace appeared in my doorway. "The mayor's office called. They want to fast-track the community engagement process for Riverside. The neighborhood association is enthusiastically supportive." "Set up the meetings," I replied, "and let's add a job training program for local residents during the construction phase. I want this project to benefit the community from day one." As Grace turned to leave, she paused. "By the way, Olivia was seen boarding a flight to Belize this morning, alone." I nodded, unsurprised. "And Tyler?" "Still in Boston, apparently meeting with his creditors. The Charlestown investors want their money back. But according to Nathan, it's already been spent on project drawings and that launch party." I returned to my work, focusing on the future rather than the past. My grandfather had taught me that true success wasn't built on shortcuts or deception, but on patience, integrity, and community value. While Tyler had been chasing quick profits and status, I had been building something meaningful, a business and a legacy that would outlast us both. 2 weeks later, as I stood at the Riverside Mill groundbreaking ceremony, shovel in hand beside the mayor and community leaders, I caught sight of a news alert on a reporter's phone. "Reed development files for bankruptcy amid investigation into Charlestown project claims." I pushed the gleaming ceremonial shovel into the earth, symbolically beginning the transformation of the abandoned mill into its new life. The gathered crowd applauded, and I looked up at the beautiful old brick building with its proud, weathered facade. Like me, it had been underestimated, dismissed as outdated and worthless. Now it would rise again, stronger and more valuable than before, not despite its history, but because of it. That evening, as I sat in my grandfather's, now my, study, I found myself remembering something he told me when I was just starting out in preservation work. "Emily, buildings are like people. The ones with character and history are always worth saving, and those who can't see their value reveal more about themselves than about what they're looking at." I opened my laptop to review the latest designs for the Riverside community spaces. While Tyler faced bankruptcy and investigations, I was building housing for families, creating jobs, and preserving a piece of Boston's soul. He had called me worthless in our divorce papers, but the truth had revealed itself without my having to say a word. Sometimes the most satisfying response isn't a response at all. It's simply moving forward and creating something of lasting value while others chase shadows. 2 mornings later, I arrived at Michael Chen's downtown office for an emergency meeting he had requested. The sleek conference room with its views of Boston Harbor stood in stark contrast to the tension in the air. Michael sat at the polished table surrounded by stacks of legal documents, his normally composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Emily," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Things have escalated faster than we anticipated." I settled into the seat, placing my leather portfolio on the table. "You mentioned it was urgent." "The Attorney General's office contacted me this morning. They're launching a formal investigation into Reed Development's Charlestown project." Michael slid a document across the table. "They've requested all Wilson preservation records pertaining to those properties, particularly any communications with Tyler or Olivia over the past year." I skimmed the official letterhead, recognizing the gravity of the situation. Of course, we have nothing to hide. There's more, Michael continued, his voice lowering slightly. According to my contact at Suffolk Bank, Tyler has taken out substantial loans against his personal assets, the Seaport condo, his stake in previous developments, even his car collection, all reportedly to fund initial construction on properties he doesn't control. I raised an eyebrow but remained silent, thinking of how casually Tyler had always leveraged himself to the maximum, confident that the next deal would cover the previous one's debts. It was his pattern: appearances first, due diligence later, if at all. The investors are in panic mode, Michael added. Some of Boston's most prominent families put money into the Charlestown project. The Whitmores, the Sullivans, even Judge Harrison's pension fund. This was concerning. These weren't just wealthy investors, but pillars of Boston society, people whose influence extended through every aspect of the city's business and political worlds. People who didn't appreciate being misled. Tyler claimed to have insider access to the Wilson properties, I said softly. He leveraged my family's reputation without having any actual connection to our holdings. Michael nodded grimly. Exactly. And now he's trying to salvage the situation by claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that he believed your marriage gave him rights to those properties, that he didn't realize the divorce would sever those presumed connections. I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. After filing divorce papers calling me financially dependent with no marketable skills, after specifically stating I brought nothing of value to our marriage. I know. Michael shuffled through more papers. I've already highlighted those contradictions for the AG's office. But Emily, you should prepare yourself. This is going to get messy. Tyler is desperate, and desperate people rarely go quietly. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with another message from Tyler. Meeting with investors at 3. Please come. Can explain everything. Need your help just this once. I showed Michael the message without comment. Are you considering it? He asked carefully. I thought about it for a moment, remembering my grandfather's approach to business crises. He never avoided difficult conversations, but he never entered them without purpose either. What would be the legal implications if I did meet with them? I asked. Michael considered this. None, if you're clear that you're there only to establish facts about property ownership. Actually, it might help the AG's investigation if you clarify on record that Tyler never had any authorization to develop those properties. I nodded slowly. Then I'll go. Not to help Tyler, but to protect the Wilson name and make our position absolutely clear to everyone involved. I'll come with you, Michael said immediately. These aren't just confused investors, they're angry people who've lost money, and Tyler might try to manipulate the situation. Let him try, I replied, gathering my things. The truth doesn't need much manipulation. Before leaving Michael's office, I called Grace to update her and asked her to send all relevant property documentation to my email. Then I headed to the Boston Public Library, my favorite place to think since childhood. In the quiet elegance of Bates Hall, with its barrel-arched ceiling and green reading lamps, I spent 2 hours reviewing every detail of the Wilson property, holdings that Tyler had claimed in his investment pitch. When I arrived at the Charlestown Yacht Club at precisely 3 p.m., I was prepared. Michael met me at the entrance, briefcase in hand, his expression professional but concerned. There are about 20 people inside, he murmured as we walked toward the private meeting room. Major investors, Tyler's attorney, and apparently Olivia has returned from Belize. Tyler looks desperate. And the investors? Furious would be an understatement. We stepped into the room, and the heated conversation instantly fell silent. All eyes turned to us. Tyler stood at the front, his normally impeccable appearance showing signs of strain, his designer suit slightly rumpled, dark circles under his eyes. Beside him, Olivia looked tense, her usual confident smile replaced by a tight-lipped expression. "Emily," Tyler said, his voice carrying a forced brightness. "Thank you for coming. I was just explaining to our investors that there's been a misunderstanding about the Charlestown properties." I nodded politely but didn't speak, taking a seat at the back of the room with Michael beside me. A silver-haired man in a bespoke suit, Robert Whitmore, if I recalled correctly, rose from his chair. "Ms. Wilson, perhaps you can clarify something for us. Your ex-husband assured us that Wilson Preservation was partnering with Reed Development on the Charlestown waterfront project. Is that accurate?" All eyes shifted to me. I met Mr. Whitmore's gaze steadily. "No, Mr. Whitmore, that is not accurate. Wilson Preservation has never authorized any partnership with Reed Development for the Charlestown properties or any other properties in our portfolio." A murmur ran through the room. Tyler stepped forward quickly. "Emily, you know we discussed redeveloping those old warehouses. Maybe not formally, but we talked about how they'd make perfect luxury condos." I maintained my composure, remembering conversations where I'd specifically opposed such ideas. "Tyler, Wilson Preservation's mission has always been adaptive reuse that maintains historical integrity while serving community needs. The Charlestown properties are slated for mixed-use development that includes affordable housing and community spaces, not luxury condos. This has been our plan for over 5 years, documented in our public filings with the City Planning Department." Another investor stood, this one a younger woman with a sharp gaze. "Mr. Reed told us that as your husband, he had insider access to Wilson properties and that the divorce wouldn't affect development rights already secured." Michael cleared his throat. "If I may address that point, at no time did Tyler Reed have any legal authority over Wilson properties. Furthermore, the divorce filing, initiated by Mr. Reed, specifically stated that Ms. Wilson brought no assets of value to the marriage." I opened my portfolio and removed a document, passing it to Michael, who distributed copies around the room. "This is the official transfer of the Wilson estate completed last Friday," I explained calmly. "As you can see, all properties in question are legally under Wilson Preservation's sole control, as they have been for generations. Any development would require our explicit authorization, which was never given to Reed Development." Tyler's face flushed with anger. "Emily, you knew I was planning this development. You could have told me about the inheritance." I met his gaze directly. "Tyler, you filed for divorce stating I was financially dependent with no marketable skills. You made your assessment of my worth and acted accordingly. I simply allowed you to proceed with your assumptions." The room fell uncomfortably silent. Olivia shifted in her seat, eyes darting between Tyler and the exit. Mr. Whitmore broke the silence. "So, to be clear, Ms. Wilson, this Charlestown development cannot and will not proceed as presented to us?" "That is correct," I confirmed. "Those buildings are part of a registered historical district. Wilson Preservation intends to renovate them according to preservation guidelines, maintaining their architectural significance while creating spaces that benefit the broader community, not unlike our Riverside Mill project that we announced on Monday. The project that's already received city approval and expedited permits," added another investor pointedly. Tyler attempted to regain control of the room. "This can still work. Emily, surely we can come to some arrangement. A partnership. Your historical expertise, my luxury development experience." I shook my head firmly. "I'm afraid not. Wilson Preservation already has an approved development plan for those properties that aligns with our company's values and mission. There will be no luxury condos on that site." A distinguished older woman, whom I recognized as Margaret Sullivan, one of Boston's most influential philanthropists, addressed me directly. "Ms. Wilson, while I appreciate your clarity today, I must ask, why didn't you come forward sooner when these investments were first being solicited? Many of us have lost significant sums." "It was a fair question," I took a moment before responding. Mrs. Sullivan, I wasn't aware of Mr. Reed's specific claims about Wilson Properties until yesterday's announcement. The inheritance proceedings were confidential until they concluded last Friday, and I had no knowledge that he was claiming development rights to properties in the Wilson portfolio. I came today specifically to provide clarity and protect both the investors and my family's reputation. Michael added, Ms. Wilson has already provided all relevant documentation to the Attorney General's office to assist in their investigation. At the mention of the Attorney General, the room's atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Several investors exchanged worried glances while others glared at Tyler with undisguised anger. So we've been defrauded, stated Mr. Whitmore bluntly. Tyler stepped forward, his composure cracking. No, it was a misunderstanding. I truly believed that you had rights to properties you never owned, interrupted another investor. That your wife's family would just hand over historical buildings for luxury condos despite their century-long commitment to preservation. Olivia suddenly stood. I need to make a call, she muttered, heading for the door. Ms. Parker, Michael called after her. The Attorney General's office will likely want to speak with you about your role in soliciting these investments. I suggest you don't leave town again. Olivia froze, then slowly returned to her seat, face pale. The meeting dissolved shortly after, with investors huddled in small groups with their attorneys, while Tyler attempted unsuccessfully to engage them in further conversation. As Michael and I prepared to leave, Tyler approached me, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. You could have warned me, he hissed under his breath. You knew what was at stake. I regarded him calmly. You made your assessment of my worth quite clear in your filing, Tyler. You stated under penalty of perjury that I brought nothing of value to our marriage. I simply allowed you to proceed with that belief. This will ruin me, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Everything I've built. Perhaps, I acknowledged without emotion. But you built on a foundation of assumptions rather than facts. My grandfather always said that was the riskiest investment of all. As we walked out into the crisp autumn air, Michael glanced at me. That went as well as could be expected. The AG's office will take it from here. And the investors? We'll likely pursue civil cases against Reed Development. Michael hesitated. Emily, I have to ask, did you know Tyler was planning this specific development when you chose not to disclose the inheritance during divorce proceedings? I considered the question carefully. I knew Tyler was always interested in developing historic waterfront properties. I didn't know he was specifically targeting the Charlestown buildings, or that he was claiming insider access to Wilson Holdings. I simply allowed the divorce to proceed on the terms he established, that I brought nothing of value to the table. Michael nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. Well, the timing worked out quite dramatically. My grandfather was a patient man, I replied simply. He understood that truth reveals itself given enough time. The following morning, Grace met me at the Wilson Preservation offices with copies of the Boston Globe and Boston Business Journal. Both featured front-page stories about the Charlestown investment controversy. The Globe's headline read, Reed Development Under Investigation. Investors claim fraud over historical properties. The Business Journal was more direct. Divorce. Dispute turns to investment scandal. Reed claimed access to ex-wife's 100 Mowers inheritance. You're handling this remarkably well, Grace observed as I skimmed the articles. What's to handle? I'm not the one who misled investors, I replied, setting aside the papers to focus on the Riverside Mill plan spread across my desk. Still, the publicity can't be pleasant. Your personal life splashed across the business section. I shrugged slightly. Grandfather always said that in Boston, business is personal and the personal is business. It's the way of old money cities. My phone buzzed with a text from Nathan Harper. Just heard from a contact at Suffolk Bank. They're calling Tyler's loans due immediately. All of them. I showed the message to Grace without comment. Not surprising, she said. Banks hate publicity. Like this. What will you do now? Focus on Riverside, I replied simply. We break ground next week. The contractor needs final approval on the community garden specifications, and the Historical Commission wants to review our plans for preserving the original loading dock mechanisms as public art. Grace studied me for a moment. Emily, I've known you since you were born. You're allowed to feel something about all this. Anger, satisfaction, anything. I set down my pen and met her gaze. What I feel is clarity. Tyler spent our entire marriage dismissing my work, my family's legacy, everything I valued. He saw buildings solely as profit vehicles, not as pieces of history or community anchors. Now everyone sees exactly who he is and who I am. That's enough. Grace nodded slowly. Your grandfather would be proud. He always said the Wilson way wasn't about revenge or gloating. It was about standing firmly in your values and letting actions speak. Exactly. I turned back to the Riverside plans. Now, let's make sure these affordable housing units maintain the original architectural details while meeting modern energy efficiency standards. For the next week, I immersed myself in the Riverside Mill project, deliberately avoiding news about Tyler or the investment scandal. But Boston is a small city, particularly in business circles, and information found its way to me regardless. Nathan reported that Tyler's Seaport condo had been listed for sale, significantly below market value. A former colleague mentioned seeing Olivia arguing with Tyler outside the Attorney General's office. Michael forwarded updates about formal complaints filed by the investors, with damages now estimated at over $6 million. I processed these updates with professional detachment, focusing instead on finalizing construction timelines and community benefit agreements for Riverside. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for the following Tuesday, with the mayor, city council members, and neighborhood representatives all confirmed to attend. The evening before the groundbreaking, as I worked late in my grandfather's library, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my housekeeper had already left for the day. Cautiously, I checked the security camera and was shocked to see Tyler standing on my doorstep, looking disheveled and desperate. For a moment, I considered not answering. There was nothing left to say between us. But something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a desire for final closure, led me to open the door. Emily, Tyler said, his voice hoarse. I need to talk to you. I don't think that's a good idea, Tyler. Our attorneys should handle any necessary communication. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from whenever he was truly stressed. Please, 5 minutes. Everything's falling apart. Against my better judgment, I allowed him into the foyer, but no further. The house, my grandfather's, historic Beacon Hill townhouse, had never been a place Tyler appreciated. He'd always pushed for us to live in newer, more modern spaces, claiming the historical details were stifling. What do you want, Tyler? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. The banks have called in everything, he said without preamble. The condo, my car, business loans, personal lines of credit. The investors are suing. The AG's office is talking about potential criminal charges for investment fraud. His eyes, bloodshot and desperate, met mine. I need help, Emily. I regarded him steadily. What kind of help are you expecting from me? A statement, something saying we had discussed the Charlestown properties, that there was a legitimate misunderstanding about development rights. His words came faster now. Or a small loan to pay back the most aggressive investors, or he hesitated before continuing. Or maybe Wilson Preservation could acquire Reed Development. Bring me on as a consultant, something to show good faith to the investigators. I stared at him, momentarily speechless at the audacity of his request. After everything, the dismissal of my work, the divorce filing belittling my contributions, the affair with my secretary, the attempt to profit from properties he knew were important to my family, he still expected me to rescue him. "Tyler," I said finally, my voice calm but firm, "you filed for divorce stating I was financially dependent with no marketable skills. You made your assessment of my worth and my business acumen perfectly clear. And now you're asking me to use those apparently non-existent skills to save you?" He flushed. The divorce filing was my lawyer's wording, not mine. "You never thought I'd see it? Or you never thought it would matter because you never respected my work enough to consider how those words might affect me?" I took a deep breath. "Tyler, I won't lie for you. I won't loan you money, and I certainly won't bring you into Wilson Preservation after you've demonstrated such fundamental disregard for everything we stand for." "Fine," he snapped, his desperation turning to anger. "I get it. This is your revenge, isn't it? Letting me crash and burn while you sit in your inherited mansion playing preservationist with Grandpa's money?" I felt a flash of anger but controlled. No, Tyler. This is simply the natural consequence of your choices. You chose to dismiss my work. You chose to file for divorce claiming I brought nothing to our marriage. You chose to misrepresent your access to properties you never controlled. Each of those decisions has led you here, not me." His shoulders slumped. "Olivia's gone," he said quietly. "Cleaned out our joint account yesterday and disappeared. Her phone's disconnected." I wasn't surprised. Olivia had always struck me as pragmatic above all else. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, not entirely untruthfully. Despite everything, I took no pleasure in his complete abandonment. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked, sounding genuinely lost. I considered his question seriously before answering. "Start over, Tyler. Sell everything. Pay back what you can to the investors. Cooperate fully with the investigation. Take responsibility for your actions instead of looking for someone else to fix it. Maybe then you can rebuild something authentic." He stared at me for a long moment. "You've changed," he said finally. "No," I corrected him. "I'm exactly who I've always been. You just never really saw me." After Tyler left, I returned to my grandfather's library and poured myself a small glass of his favorite whiskey. I wasn't celebrating Tyler's downfall. There was no satisfaction in watching someone self-destruct, even someone who had hurt me. But I did feel a quiet vindication in standing firmly in my values, in protecting my family's legacy, in creating something meaningful while Tyler had chased facades. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "All set for tomorrow's groundbreaking," press confirmed. "Construction team ready. Community representatives excited." I smiled, thinking of how the Riverside Mill would transform not just a building, but an entire neighborhood. While Tyler's world collapsed around hollow promises, I was building something solid, something that would outlast both of us. The groundbreaking ceremony the next morning was everything I'd hoped for. Standing in the shadow of the massive brick mill building, its windows boarded but its bones still strong, I felt my grandfather's presence. He had taught me to see the potential in abandoned spaces, to understand that true value often lay beneath neglect and disrepair. The mayor spoke eloquently about Boston's commitment to preserving its industrial heritage while creating housing and opportunities for its citizens. Community leaders expressed their excitement about affordable apartments and dedicated spaces for local businesses. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my focus entirely on the future. The green spaces, the job training programs, the museum celebrating the mill workers' contributions to Boston's history. The Wilson family has always believed that buildings belong to more than their owners, I told the gathered crowd. They belong to the communities that grew around them, to the workers who gave them life, to the city's shared memory. In preserving them, we honor that connection while creating new possibilities for future generations. As I pushed the ceremonial shovel into the earth, photographers captured the moment. I knew that somewhere in Boston, Tyler would likely see those images in tomorrow's papers, another reminder of what he had dismissed as a little hobby, now transforming the city landscape. But in that moment, Tyler didn't matter. What mattered was the project rising before us, the community members smiling with genuine hope, the legacy of thoughtful development that would continue long after we were gone. Later that afternoon, as I reviewed construction timelines with our project manager in my office, Michael arrived with news. "The Attorney General's office just issued indictments," he said without preamble. "Tyler's being charged with multiple counts of investment, fraud and misrepresentation. They're still looking for Olivia." I nodded, absorbing this information. "Will they need me to testify?" "Possibly, though your statement and documentation may be sufficient. The evidence is fairly straightforward. He claimed rights to properties. He didn't control." I turned to look out the window at Boston's skyline, thinking about how differently things might have turned out if Tyler had simply respected the work I cared about. If he had seen value in preservation rather than just profit in development. "Emily," Michael said gently, "this isn't your fault. You didn't create this situation." "I know," I replied, "but I can't help thinking about all the wasted potential. Tyler was talented. He could have built something meaningful if he hadn't been so focused on appearances and quick profits." "That was his choice," Michael reminded me, "just as focusing on community impact and historical integrity was yours." I turned back to the Riverside Mill plans spread across my desk. And I stand by that choice, every day. As Michael left, I received a text from Nathan. "Just heard from my contact at First Boston Bank. They're interested in discussing partnership opportunities for workforce housing in the Riverside development." I smiled, thinking of how my grandfather would have appreciated this. Major banks now seeing the value in community-focused development rather than luxury condos. The conversation was shifting, slowly but surely, toward a more balanced vision of urban growth. Outside my window, autumn leaves drifted down onto Beacon Hill's cobblestone streets. In the distance, the abandoned Riverside Mill stood waiting for its transformation. While Tyler faced the consequences of building on falsehoods, I was preparing to rebuild something authentic, something that honored both history and future. Sometimes success isn't about winning or losing, I reflected. It's about staying true to your values and creating something of lasting worth. Tyler had never understood that, but standing in my grandfather's house, surrounded by the legacy he had entrusted to me, I understood it perfectly. The Boston winter arrived early, blanketing the city in a pristine layer of snow that softened the harsh edges of urban life. From my office window, I watched construction crews working steadily at the Riverside Mill site, their breath visible in the cold air as they carefully preserved the historic brick facade while reinforcing the interior structure. Despite the freezing temperatures, we were ahead of schedule, a miracle in Boston construction terms. My phone rang, displaying Grace's name. "Emily, have you seen the news?" she asked without preamble. "I've been in meetings all morning. What happened?" "They found Olivia in Puerto Vallarta. Mexican authorities arrested her at a beachfront resort where she'd been staying under an alias. The FBI is arranging extradition." I set down my coffee mug, processing this development. Was she alone? Yes, apparently, and living quite extravagantly. Premium suite, designer shopping sprees, the works. The authorities found multiple fake passports and nearly $2 million in cash in her room safe. "The investor's money," murmured. "Most likely. The FBI is trying to trace it back to the accounts Tyler set up for the Charlestown project." I thanked Grace for the update and turned back to my window, watching the swirling snow. For weeks, I'd been so immersed in the Riverside Mill project that I'd managed to push thoughts of Tyler and Olivia to the background. But Boston's business community remained captivated by the scandal, particularly as more details emerged about how extensively they had leveraged my family name to attract investors. Michael had kept me informed of the legal proceedings. Tyler was out on bail, his passport surrendered, awaiting trial for multiple counts of fraud. Several prominent Boston families had filed civil suits against him, and his once gleaming reputation in real estate circles was irreparably tarnished. According to Nathan's banking contacts, Tyler was essentially broke, having liquidated his remaining assets to pay legal fees and make minimum restitution to the most aggressive investors. My intercom buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. "Ms. Wilson? The Historical Commission representatives are here for the tour." I gathered my portfolio and coat, pushing thoughts of Tyler aside. Today was important. The Massachusetts Historical Commission needed to approve our preservation methods for the Riverside Mill's most significant architectural elements. Their support was crucial for the next phase of tax credits that would help fund the affordable housing component. As I led the commission members through the partially renovated mill, pointing out how we were preserving the original beamwork, repurposing mechanical elements as artistic features, and restoring the massive windows to their original dimensions, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was real work, creating spaces where families would live, where communities would gather, where history would be honored while serving present needs. The integration of modern sustainability features without compromising historical integrity is impressive, Ms. Wilson, remarked Dr. Eleanor Hammond, the Commission's most exacting member. "Your grandfather would be proud." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched. Dr. Hammond had worked with my grandfather on numerous projects and didn't offer praise lightly. "We're particularly excited about the community spaces. The former loading dock will become a covered market for local vendors, and the old boiler room is being converted into a museum celebrating the mill workers' history." After the tour concluded successfully, with preliminary approval granted pending final documentation, I returned to my Beacon Hill home, shedding my coat in the warm entryway. Mrs. Sullivan, my housekeeper, not to be confused with Margaret Sullivan, the investor, had left a pot of beef stew simmering in the kitchen and fresh bread cooling on the counter. The comforting aroma filled the historic house, mingling with the scent of pine from the fire crackling in the library hearth. As I settled at my grandfather's desk with a bowl of stew, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Emily, please call me. I have a proposition that could benefit us both. T." I stared at the message, debating whether to respond or simply block the number. After our last encounter when Tyler had come begging for help, I'd hoped he would accept reality and focus on his legal defense rather than seeking another bailout. Instead of responding, I called Michael to inform him of the contact. "He's getting desperate," Michael observed after I read him the message. "The preliminary hearing is scheduled for next week, and from what I've heard, his attorney is pushing for a plea deal. The prosecution isn't feeling generous, especially with Olivia's arrest making headlines. Should I be concerned about him continuing to contact me? It's not ideal. I'll send him a formal notice to direct all communication through legal channels." Michael paused. "Emily, have you given any thought to what I mentioned about the Charlestown properties?" I sighed, knowing this conversation was inevitable. The week before, Michael had broached a delicate subject. Would Wilson Preservation consider acquiring the development rights that Tyler had fraudulently claimed, then establishing a legitimate project that could eventually help make his investors whole? It would be perfectly legal, potentially positive for all parties, and might help bring closure to the situation. "I have thought about it," I admitted, "and I'm torn. Those properties are historically significant, late 19th century warehouses, with architectural details you rarely see anymore. They deserve thoughtful restoration. But I'm not comfortable with anything that might appear to be bailing Tyler out of the consequences of his actions." "It wouldn't be bailing him out," Michael clarified. "He would still face criminal charges, still need to make restitution. but it might provide a path for the defrauded investors to eventually recover some of their losses if Wilson Preservation established a legitimate development that could generate returns. "Let me think about it more," I replied. "I need to be certain any decision is based on the property's merits and community benefit, not emotional entanglement with this situation." After hanging up, I returned to my grandfather's extensive library, pulling out his leather-bound notebook about the Charlestown waterfront district. He had meticulously documented every historical building in Boston, recording architectural details, historical significance, and potential preservation approaches. His notes on the Charlestown warehouses were extensive, including hand-drawn sketches of the ornate cornices and unusual arched windows. "Exemplary maritime commercial architecture," he'd written, "critical to preserve as testament to Boston's shipping heritage. Potential for mixed-use conversion that maintains waterfront access for public while creating sustainable commercial and residential spaces." My grandfather had envisioned these buildings' potential decades ago, long before Tyler had seen them as merely lucrative real estate for luxury condos. The Wilson preservation approach would be fundamentally different, historically respectful, community-focused, accessible to various income levels. The next morning, I met with our board of directors to discuss the quarterly performance of our various projects. The Riverside Mill was progressing well, with construction costs remaining within budget and significant interest from potential commercial tenants for the ground floor spaces. Our other ongoing preservation projects across New England were similarly successful, with the Wilson Foundation's educational programs about architectural heritage reaching record numbers of students. As the meeting concluded, I raised the question about the Charlestown warehouses, careful to frame it objectively. The Historical Commission has expressed concern about these properties remaining in limbo due to the legal complications. They've approached Wilson Preservation about potentially stepping in to ensure proper preservation. I'd like the board's thoughts on whether this is something we should explore. Eleanor Hammond, who served on both our board and the Historical Commission, spoke first. "The buildings are at risk the longer they sit vacant. Water damage from last month's storms has already affected the easternmost structure. From a preservation standpoint, intervention would be prudent." Nathan Harper, who handled our financial planning, was more cautious. "While the properties have clear historical value, we need to consider the optics given your personal connection to the current situation. Would this be seen as Wilson Preservation cleaning up your ex-husband's mess?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself. "That's my concern as well," I acknowledged. "I don't want the foundation's reputation tainted by association with the investment scandal. At the same time, I don't want historically significant buildings to deteriorate because of my personal history." Grace, who knew both my grandfather's vision and my personal struggles better than anyone, offered a measured perspective. "Perhaps we approach this as we would any other at-risk historical property. Commission an independent assessment of the building's historical and architectural significance, evaluate potential community benefit of preservation, and make a decision based solely on those factors, with you recusing yourself from the final vote to avoid any appearance of conflict." The board agreed this was the most prudent approach. We would gather information, evaluate the properties on their merits alone, and make a decision that served our preservation mission rather than any personal considerations. As winter deepened, the Riverside Mill project continued to garner positive attention. The Boston Globe ran a feature on our innovative approach to affordable housing within historical structures, highlighting how we were creating homes that honored the building's industrial past while meeting modern needs. Several architecture and preservation publications requested tours, and the mayor's office used the project as an example of ideal public-private partnership in urban renewal. Throughout this period, I deliberately maintained distance from the ongoing legal proceedings against Tyler and Olivia, focusing instead on positive impact through my work. Michael kept me updated on essential developments. Olivia had been extradited and was now in federal custody in Boston. Tyler's attorney was negotiating a plea deal that would include significant restitution and probable jail time. The civil suits were proceeding through the courts, with most investors likely to recover only pennies on the dollar. In late January, as I was reviewing architects' proposals for the Charlestown warehouse assessment, my assistant buzzed my office. "Ms. Wilson? There's a Margaret Sullivan here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent." I recognized the name immediately. One of Boston's most prominent philanthropists and one of the investors Tyler had defrauded. Though we'd met briefly at the confrontational meeting months ago, we'd had no direct communication since. "Please send her in," I replied, curious about what would bring her to my office unannounced. Margaret Sullivan entered with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to moving through Boston's highest social circles. In her 70s, impeccably dressed in a wool suit and pearls, she carried herself with the dignity of old Boston money, not flashy, but unmistakably substantial. "Ms. Wilson, thank you for seeing me without an appointment," she said, taking the seat I offered. "I've been following your work at the Riverside Mill with great interest." "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. The project is proceeding well." I waited, curious about her true purpose. She got straight to the point. "I understand Wilson Preservation is considering intervention at the Charlestown warehouses." News traveled fast in Boston business circles. "We're conducting a preliminary assessment of their historical significance and preservation needs. No decisions have been made." She nodded approvingly. "I'm here because I represent a consortium of the investors who were misled about those properties. We've been discussing an alternative to the endless legal proceedings that currently seem likely to leave everyone worse off." This was unexpected. "I'm listening." "Several of us are not merely investors but longtime supporters of historical preservation. We were actually attracted to Tyler's project partly because it involved historical buildings, though his vision for them was quite different from what I understand your foundation typically supports." I managed to suppress a smile at this diplomatic assessment of the difference between Tyler's luxury condo concept and our community-focused approach. "What we're proposing," Mrs. Sullivan continued, "is a potential partnership. If Wilson Preservation were to develop those properties according to proper historical standards, our investor group would be willing to convert our claims against Reed Development into a legitimate investment in the new project, with appropriate terms, oversight, and realistic expectations, of course." I considered this carefully. "That's an interesting proposition, Mrs. Sullivan. But I'm concerned about any arrangement that might appear to be Wilson Preservation bailing out my ex-husband's failed venture." "Not at all," she replied firmly. "Mr. Reed would not be involved in any capacity. This would be strictly between our investor group and Wilson Preservation, with all proper legal separation from the current unfortunate situation. We're simply trying to find a path forward that serves the building's historical significance, while potentially allowing investors to eventually recover some value, rather than pursuing years of likely fruitless litigation." It was a pragmatic approach that aligned with my own inclinations, preserving the buildings while creating a clear separation from Tyler's fraud. I would need to present this to our board, and we would insist on maintaining our preservation standards without compromise. We would expect nothing less. The Wilson approach to historical preservation is precisely what those buildings deserve. Mrs. Sullivan rose to leave. "I've taken enough of your time. Please consider our proposal and have your attorneys contact me if your board is interested in discussing terms." After she departed, I sat quietly, turning over this unexpected development. It offered a potential path to preserve historically significant buildings while helping innocent investors recover from Tyler's fraud, all without directly engaging with Tyler himself. It felt like a solution my grandfather would have approved. I called Michael to brief him on the meeting, then scheduled an emergency board session for the following day. That evening, as I reviewed the preliminary assessment of the Charlestown properties, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Emily Wilson speaking. Emily. Tyler's voice was instantly recognizable, though it lacked its usual confidence. Please don't hang up. I heard about Margaret Sullivan coming to see you. I sighed, unsurprised that he somehow knew about the meeting. Tyler, Michael has already informed your attorney that you should not be contacting me directly. I know, but this is important. His voice took on a desperate edge. Whatever deal they're offering you, I could be part of it. I know those buildings better than anyone. I've already done market studies, preliminary designs. Stop, I interrupted. Firmly. This is exactly why Michael instructed you not to contact me. Any arrangement Wilson Preservation might consider would explicitly exclude your involvement. The investors made that clear, and I would insist on it as well. But they're my investors. My project. The entitled tone I knew so well crept back into his voice. They were people you defrauded by claiming access to properties you didn't control, I corrected calmly. And now they're seeking a legitimate path forward that doesn't involve you. I suggest you focus on your legal defense rather than trying to insert yourself into negotiations that don't include you. You're enjoying this, aren't you? The desperation in his voice shifted to accusation. Watching everything I built collapse while you play the preservation hero with your inherited millions. I took a deep breath, refusing to be baited into an emotional response. Tyler, I take no pleasure in this situation, but I won't apologize for succeeding in the work you always dismissed, or for honoring my family's legacy in a way you never respected. Now please don't contact me again. All communication should go through our attorneys. I ended the call and immediately texted Michael to inform him of the contact. Then I returned to the Charlestown property assessment, more convinced than ever that creating clear boundaries between any Wilson Preservation involvement and Tyler's failed venture was essential. The board meeting the next day was thorough and thoughtful. We reviewed the independent assessment of the Charlestown warehouses, which confirmed their significant historical value and deteriorating condition. We discussed Mrs. Sullivan's proposal, with our legal team outlining how we could structure an arrangement that would maintain proper separation from the fraud case while potentially helping investors recover value through legitimate development. As agreed earlier, I presented the facts, but recused myself from the final vote to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest. From the adjoining room, I heard the unanimous decision. Wilson Preservation would proceed with acquiring the Charlestown warehouses and developing them according to our preservation standards, with a structure allowing the defrauded investors to convert their claims into legitimate participation. When I rejoined the meeting, Grace squeezed my hand supportively. Your grandfather would approve. This isn't about Tyler. It's about the buildings, the history, and doing what's right for the community. The process moved swiftly after that. Our legal team worked with the investors' representatives to structure the arrangement, which received court approval given its potential to provide some restitution to fraud victims. The Historical Commission enthusiastically supported our preservation plan, which would transform the warehouses into mixed-use spaces that maintained their maritime character while creating community access to the waterfront, precisely what my grandfather had envisioned decades earlier. Throughout this period, the Riverside Mill project continued to progress, with the first phase of affordable housing units nearly complete and applications from potential residents far exceeding availability. The community spaces were taking shape, with local artists commissioned to create installations celebrating the mill workers' history. One crisp March morning, as I conducted a hard hat tour of the nearly complete mill apartments for city officials, my phone buzzed repeatedly with texts from Michael, Grace, and several board members. Turn on the news when you can. As soon as the tour concluded, I returned to my office and pulled up the local news on my laptop. The headline was dramatic. Former Boston developer pleads guilty in fraud case, faces 8-10 years. Tyler had accepted a plea deal, admitting to multiple counts of investment fraud and agreeing to significant restitution. The article included a courthouse photo, Tyler in a conservative suit rather than his usual designer attire. His expression, solemn as he entered the federal building flanked by attorneys. I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was no satisfaction in seeing someone I had once loved brought so low by his own choices. Yet there was a sense of justice in the system holding him accountable for defrauding people who had trusted him with their investments. My phone rang, Michael calling with more details. The sentencing is scheduled for next month, but the plea agreement specifies 8 to 10 years with possibility of parole after serving half the sentence. The restitution order is substantial, essentially everything he still owns plus a percentage of any future earnings for the next 20 years. And Olivia? I asked. Separate case, still pending. She's maintaining that she was just following Tyler's instructions, but the evidence suggests she was a full partner in the scheme and the one who absconded with most of the investors' money. The prosecution isn't inclined to be lenient. I thanked Michael for the update and turned back to my work, but found it difficult to focus. Images kept intruding. Tyler dismissing my passion for preservation as playing with old buildings. Tyler claiming I was financially dependent with no marketable skills. Tyler standing in my foyer asking for help after everything collapsed. Around him. Later that evening, as I walked through the quiet rooms of my grandfather's house, now my house, I found myself in his library, surrounded by the books and maps and architectural drawings that had shaped my understanding of value. My grandfather had built his fortune not by chasing flashy opportunities or cutting corners, but by recognizing the worth in things others overlooked, historical buildings that could be thoughtfully repurposed, communities that could be revitalized. Through preservation, heritage that could be honored while serving present needs. Tyler had never understood this approach. He saw buildings merely as commodities, success only in terms of luxury and status. He had dismissed my work even as I expanded it beyond my grandfather's vision, bringing modern sustainability practices to historical preservation, creating affordable housing within architecturally significant structures, building community spaces that honored the past while serving the future. Now the contrast between our paths could not be more stark. While Tyler faced years in federal prison for fraud, I was preparing for the grand opening of the Riverside Mills first phase, 104 affordable apartments within a beautifully preserved industrial structure, with community spaces, local business, incubators, and a museum celebrating the building's workers and history. The Wilson preservation approach to the Charlestown warehouses would follow the same principles. Honor the historical significance while creating useful, accessible spaces. For today's community, the investors who had been defrauded by Tyler's empty promises would eventually see legitimate returns from a development that actually existed, that added real value to the city, rather than just extracting profit. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace. Don't forget, Boston Magazine interview tomorrow at 10. They want to feature Riverside as their cover story for the Changing Boston issue. I smiled, thinking of how these preservation projects were indeed changing Boston, building on its rich history rather than erasing it, creating spaces where diverse communities could afford to live and work in a city increasingly dominated by luxury development. As I prepared for bed, I realized that the path forward was clearer than ever. The legal proceedings against Tyler and Olivia would continue, but my focus would remain where it belonged, on creating developments of real value, on honoring my family's legacy of thoughtful preservation, on building something meaningful that would outlast any personal drama. Tyler had always chased the appearance of success through shortcuts and impressive facades. I had chosen instead to build something real, something that honored history while serving the present and future. Now everyone could see the difference. Spring arrived in Boston with a flourish of cherry blossoms and renewed energy throughout the city. The grand opening of the Riverside Mills first phase was scheduled for the first weekend in April, coinciding perfectly with the season of renewal. As I walked through the completed apartments the day before the ceremony, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. What had once been an abandoned industrial shell was now a vibrant community space. The original brick walls, timber beams, and soaring windows preserved and celebrated while creating comfortable, energy-efficient homes. The bow. Morning of the opening ceremony dawned clear and mild. Perfect weather for the outdoor gathering. By 9 o'clock, the restored mill courtyard was filling with people. City officials, community members, future residents, and media representatives. I stood slightly apart, watching as Grace guided visitors through the model apartment, her pride in the project evident in her animated gestures and warm smile. "Ms. Wilson?" A young woman approached me, notebook in hand. "Meredith Chen from the Boston Globe. I was hoping to get a few quotes about what this project means to you personally." I considered the question carefully. This building represents what's possible when we value both history and future, I replied. For generations, the Wilson approach to preservation has been about seeing the potential in spaces others might dismiss as obsolete. Riverside isn't just about saving a beautiful old building. It's about creating a thriving community that honors the past while meeting present needs. "And the contrast with your ex-husband's development approach?" she asked directly, her pen poised. Many people have noted the timing of this opening shortly after his sentencing. I maintained my professional composure, having anticipated this line of questioning. I'm focused on what we're creating here, not on making comparisons. The Riverside Mill speaks for itself. 104 affordable homes, spaces for local businesses, community gathering areas, and a museum celebrating the mill workers' contributions to Boston's history. That's what matters today. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with my refusal to be drawn into gossipy commentary. One last question. What's next for Wilson Preservation? I understand you've acquired the Charlestown waterfront properties that were central to the Reed development fraud case. Those buildings are historically significant maritime structures that deserve thoughtful preservation, I explained. We're still in the assessment phase, but our goal is to create another mixed-use development that respects the architectural heritage while serving community needs, affordable housing, public waterfront access, spaces for local businesses, and educational components about Boston's shipping history. Before she could ask a follow-up, the mayor approached, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. I excused myself and moved toward the podium set up in front of the mill's newly restored main entrance. The ceremony itself was everything I'd hoped for, focusing on the community impact rather than any personal narrative. The mayor spoke eloquently about the importance of preserving Boston's industrial heritage while addressing housing needs. A representative from the neighborhood association described how the project had already sparked revitalization in surrounding blocks. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my comments centered on the collaborative nature of the project and the vision for creating spaces that served diverse community needs. The highlight came when we invited the first residents, a young teacher and her elderly mother who had lived in the neighborhood for decades but been priced out of most housing, to cut the ribbon. Their genuine emotion as they officially opened, the building they would soon call home, reminded everyone present of the real purpose behind the project. As the formal ceremony concluded and guests began touring the building, Nathan Harper approached me with an unusual expression. Part concern, part curiosity. "Everything okay?" I asked. "There's someone here I thought you should know about," he said quietly. "Daniel Reed, Tyler's father. He's standing by the historical exhibit in the lobby." I hadn't seen Daniel Reed in over a year, not since before the divorce. Tyler's relationship with his father had always been complicated. The elder Reed had built a modest but respectable construction company in western Massachusetts, focusing on practical, middle-class developments rather than the luxury projects Tyler had pursued. Tyler had often spoken dismissively of his father's lack of vision, while simultaneously seeking his approval. "Thank you for letting me know," I replied, straightening my shoulders. "I should probably say hello." Daniel Reed stood examining the exhibit of historical photographs showing the mill in its heyday, workers at massive looms, managers in period attire, the surrounding neighborhood as it had appeared a century ago. At 70, he remained fit and straight-backed from decades of construction work, his weathered face a map of experiences Tyler had never appreciated. "Mr. Reed," I said as I approached, "thank you for coming today." He turned, his expression unreadable at first, then softening slightly. "Emily, this is quite an achievement." He gestured toward the surrounding space. "You've kept the soul of the old building while giving it new purpose. Not easy to do." "Thank you. That means a lot coming from someone who understands construction." I paused, unsure how to navigate the uncomfortable reality between us. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." He nodded, acknowledging the awkwardness. "Wasn't sure if I should come, to be honest. But when I read about the project, I wanted to see it for myself." He hesitated before adding, "I always thought Tyler could have learned something valuable from your approach to development if he'd been willing to listen." The simple, honest statement caught me off guard. "I appreciate that." We stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken reality of Tyler's situation hanging between us. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "I was at the sentencing yesterday." His voice was steady but tinged with the unmistakable sadness of a parent facing their child's profound failures. 8 years, with the possibility of parole after 4, plus restitution that will take him decades to fulfill, if he ever can. I nodded, unsure what response would be appropriate. "I'm sorry," I finally said, meaning it sincerely. Whatever Tyler had done, I took no pleasure in his father's pain. "Don't be," Daniel replied firmly. He made his choices, refused to build something honest, always looking for the shortcut to impress people who didn't matter. He gestured again to the mill building around us. "While you were doing this, creating something real, something with purpose." His words echoed my own thoughts so precisely that I was momentarily speechless. "Anyway," he continued, "I wanted to see your project and to tell you in person that I'm sorry for what he did." The Reed name used to stand for honest work in Western Massachusetts. Now it's associated with fraud in Boston. He sighed heavily. "Not how I imagined my legacy." "You're not responsible for his choices," I said gently. "No, but I wonder sometimes if I could have taught him different values. He was always chasing the appearance of success rather than building something meaningful." Daniel looked directly at me. "He never appreciated what he had with you, Emily. Too blinded by his own ambitions to see the value of your work, your family's legacy, your approach to business." The stark honesty of his assessment was both painful and validating. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Reed. Daniel, please." He glanced at his watch. "I should let you get back to your guests. Just wanted you to know that someone from the Reed family recognizes what you've accomplished here." As he turned to leave, I felt compelled to ask, "Will you be visiting him?" Daniel paused. "Yes. Whatever he's done, he's still my son. But I won't pretend I approve of his choices or try to bail him out of the consequences." He offered a small, sad smile. "Maybe having to face reality instead of hiding behind illusions will finally teach him something valuable." After he departed, I rejoined the celebration, guiding donors through the community spaces and introducing future residents to their neighbors. The unexpected encounter with Daniel Reed had left me reflective, but I pushed those thoughts aside to focus on the achievement being celebrated today. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and the catering staff cleared away the remains of the reception, I walked alone through the quiet building. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the massive windows, casting golden rectangles across the original wood floors we'd painstakingly restored. In the community room, the installation honoring the mill workers glowed warmly, photographs, artifacts, and oral histories preserving the stories of those who had labored here generations ago. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace. Boston. Globe already posted an article online about the opening, extremely positive, calling Riverside a model for historically respectful urban renewal that addresses real community needs. Well done, Emily. I smiled, grateful for the recognition, but more satisfied by what we had actually created. Not just positive press, but homes where people of various income levels could afford to live in an increasingly expensive city, spaces where community, connections could flourish, a development that honored rather than erased history. The contrast with Tyler's approach couldn't be more stark. While he had pursued flashy luxury developments designed to impress investors and generate quick profits, I had focused on creating spaces with lasting value, both historical and communal. His Charlestown waterfront project had existed only as misleading investment pitches and glossy renderings. Riverside Mill was real, tangible, already benefiting actual people. As April progressed, I divided my attention between overseeing the final details of Riverside's second phase and developing plans for the Charlestown warehouses. The arrangement with the investor group led by Margaret Sullivan was proceeding smoothly, with the court formally approving the structure that would allow them to convert their claims against Reed Development into legitimate participation in Wilson Preservation's project. The warehouses themselves required immediate stabilization due to water damage that had occurred during their period of limbo. I personally supervised the assessment team as they documented architectural features worth preserving and structural issues requiring urgent attention. The foundation on the easternmost building is showing signs of settling, reported Jennifer Okafor, our lead structural engineer, as we walked through the cavernous interior of the largest warehouse. Nothing that can't be addressed, but it will need to be prioritized before any adaptive reuse can begin. I made notes on my tablet, appreciating the solid construction that had allowed these buildings to stand for over a century despite neglect. The massive timbers supporting the roof, the intricate brickwork around windows and doors, the cast iron columns with decorative capitals, all worth preserving as testaments to craftsmanship rarely seen in modern construction. The Historical Commission is particularly concerned about preserving the loading dock mechanisms, I told Jennifer, pointing to the massive wooden wheels and pulleys that had once hoisted cargo from ships directly into the warehouses. My grandfather specifically mentioned them in his notes as unique examples of 19th century maritime technology. Jennifer nodded, examining the mechanisms with professional interest. We can definitely incorporate them as featured elements, similar to how we preserved the loom gears at Riverside. They'll need restoration, but the basic structures are sound. As we continued our assessment, I noticed a small group of people watching us from across the street, several elderly residents of the neighboring community, observing our activities with evident curiosity. I crossed over to speak with them, interested in their perspective. "Good morning," I greeted them. "I'm Emily Wilson from Wilson Preservation. We're assessing these buildings for historically appropriate renovation." An older gentleman with a sailor's cap nodded knowingly. "About time somebody did something with them. My father worked these docks in the 40s. Shame to see them sitting empty all these years." "What are you planning to build?" asked a woman leaning on a cane. "More luxury condos like that other company was talking about?" I shook my head. "No, our approach is quite different. We're looking at mixed-use development that preserves the historical character while creating accessible spaces for the community. Some affordable housing, local businesses, public waterfront access, and a museum component about the maritime history." Their expressions shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. "So regular folks might actually be able to live or work here?" the man asked. "Not just another playground for the rich?" "That's precisely our goal," I confirmed. "We believe historical buildings belong to the community's shared heritage, not just to whoever can pay the highest price for exclusivity." The woman with the cane smiled. Your grandfather would be proud, dear. I remember when Wilson Sr. used to come around taking photographs of these old buildings back in the 70s when everyone else thought they should be torn down. He always said they had stories worth saving. I was touched that she remembered my grandfather's early preservation work. You knew him? Everyone in Old Charlestown knew Wilson, she replied. He'd talk to anybody who had stories about the buildings. Workers, residents, shopkeepers. Treated everyone's memories as valuable, not just the official histories. This was exactly the approach I strive to continue, seeing buildings not just as architectural specimens, but as vessels for community memory and identity. If you have time, I said, I'd love to hear some of your memories of this area. They could help inform how we honor the history in our renovation. The impromptu oral history session that followed, conducted on benches facing the harbor, proved invaluable. Stories of dock workers and shipping routines, neighborhood gatherings, and maritime traditions that no official history had recorded. I made notes of details we could incorporate into the museum component, promising to consult with them as plans developed. When I returned to my office later that afternoon, Michael was waiting with news from the legal front. Olivia Parker's trial date has been set for June. The prosecution has a solid case. She was much more directly involved in the theft of investor funds than initially appeared. How so? I asked, settling behind my desk. Evidence from her seized laptops shows she was the one who created the falsified property prospectus, including doctored images implying Reed Development already owned the Charlestown properties. And she established the offshore accounts where most of the investment money ended up. Michael adjusted his glasses. Tyler may have been the face of the fraud, but she was the operational mastermind. I wasn't entirely surprised. During our marriage, I'd noticed Olivia's sharp intelligence often working behind Tyler's charismatic presentations. Do they expect her to try to shift blame to Tyler? Her attorneys have already attempted that angle, claiming she was just following her boss's instructions. But the evidence suggests otherwise, particularly her escape to Mexico with millions while leaving Tyler to face the consequences in Boston. I nodded, remembering how efficiently Olivia had disappeared with the investors' money while Tyler remained, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of his success. What about restitution? Any chance of recovering the stolen funds? Some. The Mexican authorities seized about $8 million in cash and jewelry from her hotel suite. That's a fraction of the total, but more than many fraud victims ever recover. The FBI is still tracing accounts in Belize and Panama that may contain additional funds. This was somewhat encouraging news for the investors who had opted not to participate in our Charlestown project. Those who had joined our legitimate development would eventually see returns through proper channels. But others who simply wanted their money back had seemed unlikely to recover much. On another note, Michael continued, the Boston Business Journal wants to interview you for their Resilient Boston series, focusing on how Wilson Preservation is revitalizing historically significant properties that were previously entangled. In the Reed Development fraud, I considered this carefully. I'm willing to discuss our current projects and preservation philosophy, but I'd prefer to minimize references to the fraud case or my personal connection to it. The buildings and communities deserve to be the focus, not scandal. I'll communicate that to them, Michael promised. Though I should mention, your approach to this situation has garnered significant admiration in Boston business circles. The contrast between how Reed Development operated and how Wilson Preservation functions hasn't gone unnoticed. In the weeks that followed, work began in earnest on the Charlestown properties. The stabilization team addressed the immediate structural concerns while preservation specialists carefully documented original features worth maintaining. Our architects developed preliminary concepts that would transform the warehouses into vibrant mixed-use spaces while honoring their maritime heritage. The community engagement process proved particularly rewarding. We held multiple listening sessions where longtime residents shared their hopes for the development. Affordable housing for seniors who had lived in the neighborhood all their lives but were being priced out. Job opportunities for local youth. Spaces where maritime traditions could be celebrated and taught to new generations. Margaret Sullivan and her investor group participated constructively in the planning process, proving true to their word that they valued proper historical preservation over quick profits. Their business expertise complemented our preservation focus, helping refine the commercial aspects of the project to ensure sustainability while maintaining community benefits. One evening in late May, as I reviewed the latest Charlestown plans in my home office, Grace called with surprising news. "Emily, you need to see the feature that just posted on Boston Magazine's website. It's about Tyler's sentencing and incarceration at the federal prison in Devons." I hesitated, reluctant to focus on Tyler when I had actual work to accomplish. "Is there something specific I need to know?" "They interviewed him," Grace said, her voice conveying unusual concern. "And he said some things about you and Wilson preservation that you should be aware of." Sighing, I opened my laptop and found the article Grace mentioned. The piece was titled, "The Fall of Boston's Flash Developer. Inside Reed's Prison Reckoning." Most of it covered familiar territory: the fraud scheme, the investor losses, the legal proceedings. But toward the end, the journalist had included direct quotes from their prison interview with Tyler. "I lost sight of what real development should be," Tyler had apparently said. "While I was chasing luxury and status, my ex-wife was creating something authentic through preservation. I didn't see the value in what the Wilson approach represented until it was too late." I stared at the screen, reading and rereading these words that seemed so unlike the Tyler I had known. The man who had dismissed historical preservation as outdated, who had called me financially dependent with no marketable skills. The article continued with more quotes. "The Riverside Mill project demonstrates what development should accomplish, honoring history while serving community needs. It's the antithesis of what I was doing, and I regret not recognizing the wisdom in Emily's approach when I had the chance to learn from her." "This is unexpected," I said finally to Grace, who had remained silently on the phone. "Do you think he's sincere?" she asked. "Or just trying to rehabilitate his image?" It was impossible to know. Prison could prompt genuine reflection, or it could simply teach someone to say what others wanted to hear. "Either way, it doesn't change our work," I replied. "Whether Tyler has had a genuine epiphany or is just seeking public sympathy, Wilson. Preservation will continue doing exactly what we've always done, creating developments of real value that honor history while serving present needs." Grace agreed, and we turned our conversation to more pressing matters: the timeline for the Charlestown project, preparations for the Riverside Mill's second phase opening, and a newly available historical theater in Cambridge that the Preservation Commission had asked us to assess. Yet later that night, alone in my grandfather's library, I found myself returning to Tyler's words. Was it possible that he truly understood now what he had never grasped during our marriage? That preservation wasn't about clinging to the past, but about building thoughtfully for the future? That flash and luxury weren't sustainable substitutes for authenticity and community value. It didn't matter, I finally concluded. Tyler's belated recognition, if genuine, changed nothing about the path forward. The Riverside Mill was already transforming lives through affordable housing and community spaces. The Charlestown warehouses would soon undergo a similar renaissance. Wilson Preservation would continue creating developments of substance rather than mere appearance, regardless of whether my ex-husband had finally recognized the value in this approach. The next morning, I visited the Riverside Mill to check on the community garden being installed behind the building. Residents were already working alongside professional landscapers, planting vegetables and herbs in raised beds designed for accessibility. Children darted between the garden plots, their laughter echoing against the mill's brick walls. "Ms. Wilson," called Eliza Santos, the young teacher who had been one of the first residents to move in. "Come see what we're planting." I joined her at a thriving garden bed where she and her elderly mother were carefully setting tomato seedlings into rich soil. "These will be ready to harvest by late summer," Eliza explained enthusiastically. "We're planning a community dinner with everything grown right here in the garden." "That's wonderful," I replied, genuinely moved by how quickly the residents had formed connections and created traditions in their new home. This is exactly what we hoped would happen in these spaces. Mrs. Santos, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades before being priced out of her previous apartment, looked up from her planting. "My grandmother worked in this mill, you know. As a girl, I used to wait outside those gates to walk her home. Never imagined I'd someday live inside these walls." She gestured toward the soaring brick structure behind us. "You kept the outside looking just like I remember, but made the inside something new and good. That's a special kind of magic, keeping the past alive while making room for tomorrow." Her simple, profound assessment of our work touched me deeply. This living connection between past and future, this revitalization that honored history while creating new opportunities, was the essence of the Wilson approach to preservation. It wasn't about profits or prestige, but about continuity and community, about recognizing value in what others might discard. As I watched residents of various ages working together in the garden, I felt a sense of satisfaction deeper than any I had experienced in my professional life. The mill that had once been abandoned was now alive again with purpose. Not the same purpose as in its industrial heyday, but one equally vital to the community it served. Whatever recognition came to Wilson Preservation through awards or press coverage, this was the true measure of our success. Creating spaces where people could afford to live with dignity, where history was honored rather than erased, where community could flourish across generations. While Tyler had sought validation through luxury and exclusivity, I had found it in accessibility and inclusion, in developments that served real human needs while preserving our shared heritage. The contrast between our approaches had never been clearer, nor had the satisfaction of building something authentic rather than chasing appearances. As I helped Mrs. Santos plant one more tomato seedling in the rich soil, I felt gratitude for my grandfather's legacy, not just the financial inheritance that had made headlines, but the more valuable inheritance of values, vision, and purpose that continued to guide Wilson Preservation forward. 1 year after the Riverside Mill's grand opening, Boston experienced its warmest autumn in decades. The unseasonable warmth brought crowds to the newly completed Charlestown Waterfront Plaza, where Wilson Preservation had transformed once derelict warehouses into a vibrant mixed-use development that honored the area's maritime heritage while serving present community needs. I stood on the restored dock, watching families stroll along the harbor walk we'd created, elderly residents sharing stories in the Maritime Museum housed within the largest warehouse, and small business owners welcoming customers to shops and cafes designed specifically to foster local entrepreneurship rather than national chains. "Quite a transformation," said Margaret Sullivan, joining me at the railing. Now, in her late 70s, she remained a formidable presence in Boston's business and philanthropic circles. As the lead investor in our legitimate Charlestown development, she had become a valued advisor and supporter. "It exceeded even my expectations," I admitted, gesturing toward the bustling public plaza where cargo had once been loaded. "Seeing people actually using these spaces, making them their own, that's the real measure of success." Margaret nodded, her shrewd eyes taking in the scene. "The investors group received our first quarterly returns yesterday. Modest but legitimate, unlike the fantasies Reed was selling. More importantly, we've helped create something of lasting value for the city." This validation from someone who had initially been victimized by Tyler's fraud felt particularly meaningful. The arrangement we'd structured had allowed the defrauded investors to convert their claims against Reed Development into participation in a legitimate project that was now generating actual returns while benefiting the broader community. The Historical Commission is featuring Charlestown in their annual Preservation Awards, I told her. They're particularly impressed with how we integrated the original loading dock mechanisms as functional public art. Well-deserved recognition, Margaret replied. Though I suspect that seeing neighborhood children playing in spaces that were once abandoned gives you more satisfaction than any award. She was right. While professional accolades were gratifying, the true measure of our success was evident in the elderly residents who could afford to remain in their lifelong neighborhood, the local entrepreneurs who had found affordable commercial space, and the community groups using our meeting facilities to organize everything from youth programs to senior activities. As Margaret departed for another engagement, Grace joined me, tablet in hand. The Boston Globe piece just posted online, she announced. They're calling Charlestown the new standard for historically responsible urban renewal, and Wilson preservation the antithesis of exploitative development. I scrolled through the article on Grace's tablet, noting how the journalist had contrasted our approach, preserving architectural heritage while creating accessible, community-focused spaces, with the luxury-centered development that dominated much of Boston's waterfront. The piece mentioned Tyler's fraud case only briefly, focusing instead on how Wilson preservation had rescued historically significant buildings while creating genuine community benefit. There's more, Grace said, taking back the tablet and opening another article. Boston Business Monthly named you to their 40 under 40 list. The profile highlights how you've expanded Wilson preservation beyond your grandfather's vision, integrating affordable housing and sustainability practices into historical renovation. I smiled, thinking of how my grandfather would have embraced these evolving approaches. He had always seen preservation not as freezing buildings in time, but as giving them new purpose while honoring their heritage. He laid the foundation. I'm just building on it. Speaking of building, Grace continued, switching to her calendar app. The Cambridge Historical Theater Committee wants to meet next week about potential acquisition. They're facing pressure from developers who want to convert it to luxury condos, but they're hoping Wilson preservation might offer an alternative vision. This was becoming a familiar pattern. Community organizations reaching out to us when historically significant buildings were threatened by development that would render them inaccessible to the general public. Wilson preservation was increasingly seen as a third way between neglect and gentrification, an approach that valued both preservation and accessibility. Schedule the meeting, I confirmed. And let's bring Nathan to discuss financing options that could make it viable as a community. Performance space. Grace made the note, then hesitated before adding, Michael called. Tyler's parole hearing is scheduled for next month. His sentence was reduced for cooperation in Olivia's case, so he's eligible for early release after serving just over 2 years. I absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Tyler had received an 8-year sentence, but his cooperation had proven crucial in building the case against Olivia, who had ultimately been sentenced to 15 years for her larger role in both the fraud and the theft of investor funds. The evidence from her laptops and accounts had revealed her as the primary architect of the scheme, with Tyler as the charismatic frontman whose family connections and social standing had opened doors with wealthy investors. Will you need to make a statement for the hearing? Grace asked carefully. I shook my head. That's not necessary. His crimes weren't against me personally, but against the investors. Their representatives should speak if anyone does. I paused, then added, though I doubt I'd oppose his parole. 2 years is enough to reflect on choices and consequences. Grace nodded, understanding my perspective without requiring further explanation. After a moment, she gestured toward the bustling development around us. The community garden installation begins tomorrow. The Neighborhood Association is sending volunteers to help plant the heritage varieties recommended by the historical botanist. This detail, recreating plantings that would have been common in Charlestown during its shipping heyday, exemplified our approach to honoring history in living ways rather than mere preservation of empty structures. The garden would provide both educational value about historical cultivation practices and fresh produce for community residents. As Grace departed to oversee preparations for a donor reception that evening, I continued my walk through the development, pausing to observe interactions between visitors and residents, noting how people were using the spaces we'd created. A group of students sat sketching the historical architecture as part of an educational program we'd established with local schools. Senior citizens gathered around tables in the public plaza, playing chess and sharing stories. Local artists displayed their work in the gallery space we'd designated for community cultural events. This was what success looked like to me, not luxury condos accessible only to the wealthy, but vibrant spaces where diverse community members could afford to live, work, and gather while surrounded by the authentic character of Boston's maritime heritage. My phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. Cambridge Theatre Committee thrilled about potential meeting. Said they specifically want the Wilson approach rather than standard development. Your reputation precedes you. I smiled, remembering how Tyler had once dismissed my preservation work as a little hobby that would never generate real money compared to his luxury developments. Now, Wilson Preservation was the standard bearer for an approach that balanced historical integrity with community needs, while Tyler's Flash and Dash Development Company existed only in cautionary business school case studies about investment, fraud. As evening approached, I returned to my Beacon Hill home to prepare for the donor reception supporting our educational programs. These initiatives brought preservation concepts to schools throughout Boston, helping young people understand the value of historical buildings and community-focused development. While changing for the event, I noticed a letter on my dresser that had arrived earlier that week from the Federal Correctional Facility in Devens, where Tyler was serving his sentence. I had set it aside, uncertain whether I wanted to read whatever he might have to say after more than 2 years of silence. Now, with a few minutes to spare before departing for the reception, I carefully opened the envelope. Emily, the letter began in Tyler's familiar handwriting. I've written and discarded dozens of versions of this letter over the past year. Nothing seems adequate to address what happened between us and the choices I made that led me here. I won't burden you with apologies that can't undo the harm I caused to investors who trusted me, to the Reed name my father built through honest work, or to you through my dismissal of your vision and values. Actions matter more than words, something I finally understand after seeing how your actions have transformed Boston, while my empty promises led nowhere. The Boston Globe featured Riverside Mill in their prison library, seeing what you've created, spaces that honor history while serving real community needs, has forced me to confront how shallow my understanding of development truly was. I chased luxury and status while you built something authentic and meaningful. I called you financially dependent with no marketable skills in our divorce filing, words that reveal far more about my own blindness than about your capabilities. You always saw value where I saw only profit potential, sustainability where I saw only marketable features, community needs where I saw only wealthy client desires. As I face my parole hearing, I've been reflecting on what kind of work I might pursue after release. The easy path would be returning to luxury development, leveraging whatever connections still remain open to me. The harder but more meaningful path would be following something closer to the Wilson approach, creating spaces that serve broader community needs while respecting historical context. I don't expect your guidance or forgiveness. This letter isn't seeking anything from you. It's simply an acknowledgement of truth that's taken me too long to see. That true development isn't about extracting maximum profit from properties, but about creating spaces that honor both past and future, while serving genuine human needs. Whatever path I follow after release, I wanted you to know that your work has had impact even in unexpected places like this prison library, where seeing Riverside Mill and Charlestown has prompted discussions among inmates about what responsible development could look like in the communities many of us came from. With respect and belated recognition of the value in your approach, Tyler, I refolded the letter carefully, processing its contents with complicated emotions. Was this genuine insight or strategic positioning before a parole hearing? Had 2 years in prison truly transformed Tyler's understanding of value? Or was this another performance designed to achieve a specific outcome? It wasn't my place to judge his sincerity. That would be for the parole board and, eventually, for whatever community received him after release. What mattered was that I had stayed true to my values and vision, building developments that honored both history and community while creating spaces of genuine accessibility rather than exclusive luxury. I placed the letter in my desk drawer and finished preparing for the evening's event. The donor reception would help fund educational programs bringing preservation concepts to schools throughout Boston, ensuring future generations understood the value of historical buildings and community-focused development. As I drove to the reception at the Riverside Mills Community Center, I reflected on the journey of the past 3 years, from being labeled financially useless in divorce papers to leading Boston's most respected preservation organization, from watching Tyler dismiss my work to seeing Wilson Preservation praised as the standard for responsible urban renewal. The Riverside Mill glowed warmly in the evening light as I approached, its beautifully restored brick exterior illuminated, to highlight architectural details previously hidden under decades of neglect. Inside, the community center buzzed with activity, donors mingling with neighborhood residents, preservation experts chatting with local business owners who had found affordable commercial space in our development. Eliza Santos, the young teacher, who had been one of Riverside's first residents, was now leading the after-school program operating from our community center. "Ms. Wilson," she called, waving me over to a display of student artwork. The children created these based on architectural elements throughout the building. They're learning to see details most adults walk right past. I examined the colorful interpretations of the mill's distinctive windows, staircases, and structural elements, each revealing how carefully the young artists had observed their surroundings. This was preservation education at its most fundamental, teaching future generations to value the craftsmanship and design that distinguished historical buildings from modern construction. "They're wonderful," I told Eliza sincerely. "This is exactly what my grandfather hoped for when he began preserving these old buildings. Not just saving architectural features, but helping people connect with the human stories and skills they represent." The reception proceeded smoothly, with several major donors increasing their commitments to our educational initiatives after seeing their impact firsthand. As I circulated through the crowd, I was struck by the diverse mix of people our work had brought together: preservation experts and neighborhood residents, business leaders and community activists, all finding common ground in the value of thoughtfully repurposed historical spaces. Later that evening, as the event concluded and guests departed, I lingered in the mill's central atrium, a soaring space where massive looms had once produced textiles, now transformed into a community gathering area without sacrificing its industrial character. The original timber beams remained exposed overhead, the brick walls still bore traces of their manufacturing past, and the enormous windows that had once provided natural light for factory workers now illuminated community activities. Grace joined me in the quiet space, her expression thoughtful. "Remember when we first toured this building 3 years ago? Most developers had dismissed it as too damaged to salvage, too complicated to repurpose." I nodded, recalling how Tyler had scoffed at my interest in the abandoned mill, calling it a decaying money pit, compared to the sleek luxury towers he preferred to build. Now it's home to over 200 people who otherwise couldn't afford to live in this neighborhood, plus businesses that employ local residents, community spaces that serve diverse needs, and educational programs that reach throughout Boston. "And it's financially sustainable," Grace added, always practical. "Not generating the instant profits Tyler's luxury developments promised, but providing steady returns while creating lasting value. Exactly what your grandfather believed preservation should accomplish." As we walked toward the exit, a mosaic Caught the Evening Light, an installation created by community members from materials found during renovation, incorporating fragments of the building's past into a new artistic expression. It perfectly symbolized the Wilson approach to preservation, not freezing buildings in time, but giving them new purpose while honoring their heritage, not extracting maximum profit, but creating maximum community benefit. Outside, Boston's skyline glittered against the darkening sky. A mix of historical structures and modern towers that told the story of a city constantly evolving yet anchored by its past. Within that landscape, Wilson Preservation's projects stood as examples of development that respected both history and future, that created spaces serving real human needs rather than merely wealthy desires. The contrast with Tyler's approach could not have been more complete. While he had pursued flashy luxury developments designed to generate quick profits and personal prestige, I had focused on creating spaces with lasting value, both historical and communal. His Charlestown waterfront project had existed only as misleading investment pitches and glossy renderings. Riverside Mill and our legitimate Charlestown development were real, tangible, already benefiting actual people while honoring Boston's architectural heritage. As I drove home through familiar streets, I thought about Tyler's impending parole hearing and his letter expressing newfound appreciation for the Wilson approach to development. Whether his insights were genuine or strategic, whether prison had truly transformed his understanding or merely taught him what to say, one thing remained certain. I had stayed true to my grandfather's vision while expanding it to meet contemporary needs, creating developments that would continue serving communities long after headlines about divorce and inheritance had faded from memory. In my grandfather's library that evening, surrounded by the books and maps and architectural drawings that had shaped my understanding of value, I felt a profound sense of continuity, not just with my family's legacy, but with generations of craftspeople who had created the historical buildings we now preserved, and with future generations who would benefit from spaces that honored both past and future. Sometimes the most satisfying success isn't about money or headlines, I reflected. It's about creating something authentic and meaningful, while others chase shallow appearances. About staying true to your values even when others dismiss them. About building spaces that serve real human needs while honoring the craftsmanship of those who came before. In that quiet moment, the $100 million inheritance that had made headlines during our divorce seemed almost incidental compared to the true legacy I was building. Developments that transformed communities while preserving their heritage, spaces that remained accessible rather than exclusive, buildings that connected past and future in ways that would outlast any fortune. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.